it.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Shaun Jeffery.
The north end of Boston in the early 1900s was one of the most congested neighborhoods, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. One historian likened its population density to that of Calcutta, India. There were about 40,000 people, most of them Italian immigrants, in about a 1 mile square of geographic space. And also an enormously congested commercial area. Most of the shipping that went to Europe and up and down the East Coast left from that north end waterfront area. In the midst of all this congestion, there was an enormous steel tank, 5 stories high, about 50 feet tall, and it held about 2.3 million gallons of molasses.
Here at our studio where we record, we have a beer fridge out the back. On the beer fridge is a sticker, distributed as promotional material by the Bundaberg Rum Distilling Company. The sticker depicts 5 well-dressed gentlemen sitting waist-deep in a brown, gooey substance. The slogan across the sticker reads, quote, "When life smothers you in molasses, make rum." I always wondered what that was supposed to be referencing, until one day I learned about the Great Molasses Flood, in what was probably one of the most bizarre disasters in United States history. A storage tank burst on Boston's waterfront, releasing over 2 million gallons of molasses. A giant, sweet, gooey wave raced through the city's north end at over 35 miles per hour, destroying everything in its path. The wave killed young Pasquale Ian Tosca, smashing a railroad car into the 10-year-old child. It pinned Walter Merrithew, a railroad clerk on the Commercial Street wharf, against the wall of a nearby freight shed. His feet were 3 foot off the floor. He hung there as he watched a horse drowning in molasses nearby. The strength of the wave broke steel girders of the Boston Elevated Railway. It almost swept a train off its tracks. It knocked buildings off their foundations and toppled electrical poles, their wires hissing and sparking as they fell into the brown flood. The Boston Globe reported that people were picked up and hurled many feet. A small boat was found, slammed through a wooden fence, like an artillery shell. By the time it passed, the wave had caused damage worth over $100 million in today's money. All this chaos caused by a sweet, sticky food additive. Molasses, or black treacle, is a viscous product resulting from refining sugarcane or sugar beets into sugar. Molasses varies by amount of sugar, method of extraction, and age of plant. Sugarcane molasses is primarily used for sweetening and flavouring foods in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, while sugar beet molasses is foul-smelling and unpalatable, so it's mostly used as an animal feed additive in Europe and Russia, where it's chiefly produced. Molasses is a defining component of fine commercial brown sugar. So, again, how does something so sweet and innocent cause such devastation? In 1919, the New York Times wrote, A dull muffled roar gave but an instant's warning before the top of the tank was blown into the air. 2 million gallons of molasses rushed over the streets and converted into a sticky mass the wreckage of several small buildings which had been smashed by the force of the explosion. Wagons, carts and motor trucks were overturned. A number of horses were killed. The street was strewn with the debris intermixed with molasses and all traffic was stopped. It was January. The setting was the city of Boston. And when 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst from a gigantic holding tank in the city's north end, 21 people would be killed, and over 150 more were left injured. The wave of syrup, some people reported, had a peak height between 25 and 40 feet tall, over 8 meters high. It rushed through the waterfront, destroying buildings, overturning vehicles, and pushing a firehouse completely off its foundation. The disaster occurred at the Purity Distilling Company's facility on January 15th. The temperature had risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or 4 degrees Celsius, climbing rapidly from the frigid temperatures of the preceding days. Molasses can be fermented to produce rum, and ethanol, the active ingredient in other alcoholic beverages, and so there, the mystery of the Bundaberg rum sticker slogan was solved. When life smothers you in molasses, make rum. Molasses is also, though, a key component in the manufacturing of munitions. The stored molasses was awaiting transfer to the Purity plant situated between Willow Street and what is now named Everette's Way in Cambridge. At about 12:30 in the afternoon near Keeney Square, at number 529 Commercial Street, a molasses tank, 50 feet or 15 metres tall, and 90 feet, 27 metres in diameter, and containing as much as 2.3 million US gallons or 8,700 cubic metres, collapsed. Witnesses variously reported that as it collapsed they felt the ground shake and heard a roar, a long rumble similar to the passing of an elevated train, a tremendous crashing and a deep growling, or a thunderclap-like bang. And as the rivets shot out of the tank, machine gun-like fire raked the walls of the city. The Boston Globe reported that people were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. Others had debris hurled at them from the rush of sweet-smelling air. A truck was picked up and hurled into Boston Harbor. In 1983, an article for the Smithsonian by Edward Parks quoted one child's experience. Anthony DeStasio, walking homeward with his sisters from the Michelangelo School, was picked up by the wave and carried, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he were surfing. Then he grounded, and the molasses rolled him like a pebble as the wave diminished. He heard his mother call his name and couldn't answer. His throat was so clogged with the smothering goo. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his 4 sisters staring down at him. First to the scene of the explosion were 116 cadets under the direction of Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland from the USS Nantucket, a training ship of the Massachusetts Nautical School. That ship was docked nearby at the playground pier. The cadets ran several blocks toward the accident. They worked to keep the curious from getting in the way of the rescuers, while others entered into the knee-deep, sticky mess to pull out any survivors. Soon, the Boston Police, Red Cross, Army, and other Navy personnel arrived to help. Some nurses from the Red Cross dove into the molasses while others tended to the injured, keeping them warm and keeping the other exhausted workers fed. Many of these people worked all the way through the night. The injured were so numerous that doctors and surgeons set up a makeshift hospital in a nearby building. rescuers found it difficult to make their way through the syrup to help other victims. 4 days elapsed before they stopped searching for victims. Many of the dead were so glazed over in molasses that they were hard to recognise. Local residents brought a class action lawsuit, one of the first held in Massachusetts, against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the USIA, which had bought the Purity Distilling Company in 1917. In spite of the company's attempts to claim that the tank had been blown up by anarchists because some of the alcohol produced was to be used in making munitions, a court-appointed auditor found the USIA responsible after 3 years of hearings. United States Industrial Alcohol Company ultimately paid out $600,000 in out-of-court settlements, around $6.5 million in today's money. Relatives of those killed reportedly received around $7,000 per victim. Cleanup crews used salt water from a fireboat to wash the molasses away and used sand to try to absorb it. The harbour was brown with molasses until the next summer. The cleanup in the immediate area took weeks, with more than 300 people contributing to the effort. The cleanup in the rest of the greater Boston area and the surrounding suburbs would take an even longer time. Rescue workers, cleanup crews and sightseers had tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to pay telephone handsets, into houses and countless other places. Everything a Bostonian touched was sticky. For nearly 100 years, no one really knew why the spill was so deadly. But at a recent meeting of the American Physical Society, a team of scientists and students presented what may be an important piece of the century-old puzzle. They concluded that when a shipment of molasses, newly arrived from the Caribbean, met the cold winter airs of Massachusetts, the conditions were ripe for a calamity to descend upon the city. By studying the effects of cold weather on molasses, the researchers determined that the disaster was more fatal in the winter than it would have been during a warmer season. The syrup moved quickly enough to cover several blocks within seconds and then thickened into a harder goo as it cooled and settled, slowing down the wave but also hindering rescue efforts. It's a ridiculous thing to imagine, a tsunami of molasses drowning the north end of a city. But then all you have to do is look at some of the pictures. When the molasses arrived in Boston's harbour, it was heated by just a few degrees. The warmer temperature made it less viscous and therefore easier to transport to a storage tank near the waterfront. When the tank burst 2 days later, the molasses was still probably about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding air. If, for example, the tank had burst in a warmer month, the wave would have flowed further but also been thinner, easier to escape. In the winter, however, after the initial burst, which lasted between 30 seconds and a few minutes, the cooler temperature of the outside air raised the viscosity of the molasses, essentially trapping people who had not been able to escape the wave. About half the people who were killed died basically because they were stuck. A firefighter who survived the initial wave managed to stay alive for nearly 2 hours while he waited to be rescued, but he slowly drowned, entombed in the molasses. Again, quoting the Boston Globe, men and women, their feet trapped by the sticky mass, slipped and fell and were suffocated. The stronger tried to save others, and many of them died for their heroism. The Great Molasses Flood seems like a tragedy that could have been averted. But then you read about an almost identical incident that happened around 100 years before the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. the London beer flood of 1814. And you wonder why they didn't learn this lesson already. Boston is in an area of the US known as New England. These settlers came from England, set up shop in Boston, and then repeated the exact same scenario. The London beer flood happened on the 17th of October, 1814, in the parish of St Giles, London, England. At the Moe and Company Brewery in Tottenham Court Road, a huge vat containing over 135,000 imperial gallons, 610,000 litres of beer, ruptured. This caused other vats in the same building to succumb to a sort of domino effect. One after the other, they all exploded. As a result, more than 323,000 imperial gallons, or nearly 1.5 million litres of beer, burst out and gushed into the streets. The wave of beer destroyed 2 homes and crumbled the wall of the Tavistock Arms pub, killing a teenage employee, Eleanor Cooper, under the rubble. Within minutes, neighbouring George Street and New Street were also swamped, seriously injuring a mother and killing a daughter and a young neighbour who were just having tea. The beer also surged through a room of people gathered for a wake, killing 5 of them. The brewery was situated among the poor houses and tenements of the St Giles Rookery, where whole families lived in basement rooms that quickly filled with beer. At least 8 people were known to have drowned in the flood or died from resulting injuries. The brewery was eventually taken to court over the accident, but the disaster was ruled to be an act of God by the judge and jury, leaving no one responsible. Classic God, am I right? So God's sitting there like,
You know what would be hell funny? If I drowned this baby with beer and crushed this poor girl with rubble. No? Not a good one? Let me work on it. How about in 100 years I drown a city in molasses? Wouldn't that be sweet? Lucifer would have laughed. I miss him.